Art 1. The Final Night. Why did Jimi Hendrix die at 27? On a September morning in 1970, in London, one of the greatest guitarists in history was found unconscious. He was only 27 years old. Jimi Hendrix was at the height of his fame. In just a few short years, he had gone from an unknown guitarist to one of the most influential musicians in the world. But on the night of September 17, everything changed. Hendrix was in London with Monica Dannemann. Hours later, he was found unconscious and rushed to the hospital in critical condition. He never woke up. Jimi Hendrix died at just 27 years old. And almost immediately, questions began to surround his final hours. What was the real cause of his death? What really happened inside that hotel room that night? Why were the accounts of Hendrix's final hours not completely consistent? Why did the person who was reportedly with him become the focus of so much suspicion? And perhaps most haunting of all, how exhausted had Hendrix really become before his death? There was another detail that made the story even more disturbing. Hendrix had reportedly told people that he was not sure he would live to see his 28th birthday. Was that simply the confession of a troubled young man who was afraid and uncertain about his future? Or had Hendrix somehow sensed just how fragile his life had become? More than half a century later, the circumstances surrounding his death continue to raise questions and fuel speculation. Some theories have never been proven, while many details surrounding that final night remain controversial. But one thing is certain: the world lost Jimi Hendrix before he ever reached the age of 28. So what happened to the young man who seemed destined to change the history of music? To understand the mystery of his final night, we have to go back many years, to a time when Jimi Hendrix was not yet a legend. Part 7. Monica Dannemann and Jimi Hendrix's Final Hours. On the night Jimi Hendrix died, there was one person who was with him during his final hours: Monica Dannemann. The story of their relationship began after a Hendrix performance in Germany. Dannemann was a German figure skater and a devoted admirer of Hendrix. After meeting him, the two became close, and she later described their relationship as deeply romantic. But over the years, that description became controversial. People who knew Hendrix offered different impressions of how close the two really were. Some suggested that their relationship was much more casual than Dannemann later claimed. Because of these conflicting accounts, their relationship became an important part of the mystery surrounding Hendrix's death. Then came the night of September 17, 1970. Hendrix was in London with Dannemann. According to the accounts presented in reports about his final hours, he had been struggling to sleep after using stimulants. He later took sleeping medication. What happened afterward remains the subject of debate. At some point during the morning, Dannemann discovered that Hendrix was unresponsive. An ambulance was eventually called, and Hendrix was taken to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital. But he could not be saved. Jimi Hendrix was pronounced dead at the age of 27. What we know. There are several facts that are generally accepted. Hendrix spent his final night with Dannemann in London. He had experienced difficulty sleeping and had taken sleeping medication. He was later found unresponsive and transported to hospital, where he died. His death was officially associated with asphyxia from inhalation of vomit while intoxicated with barbiturates, according to the coroner's findings. But the circumstances surrounding those final hours have continued to generate questions. What remains controversial? One major source of controversy has been Dannemann's changing accounts of what happened that morning. Questions were raised about when exactly she discovered Hendrix's condition and when emergency services were contacted. Her later descriptions of the events were not always consistent, which contributed to suspicion surrounding her role. There were also later allegations from people connected to Hendrix, suggesting that evidence of drug use may have been removed from the scene. However, such claims have themselves been disputed and cannot simply be treated as established fact. Then came even more dramatic theories. Some years later, allegations emerged involving Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, including a claim that he had confessed to arranging Hendrix's death. Other theories suggested the involvement of organized crime or other outside forces. But none of these murder theories has been conclusively established, and that distinction matters. There is a difference between what is documented, what was alleged, and what remains speculation. The official record points to a drug-related death. Yet the conflicting testimonies, unanswered questions, and later allegations created a mystery that has survived for decades. Perhaps that is why Hendrix's final night continues to fascinate people more than half a century later. Because when a 27-year-old musical genius dies suddenly, at the height of his fame, people naturally want to know whether the story they were given tells the whole truth. If Hendrix's death was simply a tragic accident, why are people still debating what really happened on that final night more than 50 years later? Part 5. Behind the Glory. A genius slowly wearing himself out. From the outside, Jimi Hendrix seemed to have everything. He was young, he was famous, his records were being heard around the world, and thousands of people were willing to pay simply to watch him step onto a stage with a guitar in his hands. But behind the image of the fearless rock star was a very different reality. Jimi Hendrix was exhausted. His rise had happened with extraordinary speed. Once he became an international star, the demands on him seemed almost endless. Concerts, recording sessions, rehearsals, interviews, travel, and appearances followed one another with barely enough time to recover. He was constantly moving from one city to another, then from one country to another. And every time he walked onto a stage, audiences expected something extraordinary. Hendrix had built his reputation on performances that seemed almost effortless. But what the audience saw for a few minutes could hide the physical and emotional cost behind it. There was always another concert, another recording session, another expectation to satisfy. And the pressure was not only artistic. As Hendrix became more successful, his financial affairs became increasingly complicated. Money flowed around him, but that did not necessarily mean that he had complete control over it. Business relationships, contracts, and disagreements added another layer of stress to a life that was already moving at an exhausting speed. Then there were his personal relationships. Hendrix's world was filled with musicians, managers, friends, women, promoters, and people who wanted to be close to one of the biggest stars of the era. But fame can make it difficult to know who genuinely cares about you, and who simply wants something from you. By the final period of his life, Hendrix was reportedly becoming increasingly frustrated and uncertain about the people around him. The contrast was striking. On stage, he appeared powerful and completely in control. Off-stage, his life was becoming increasingly complicated. And perhaps the greatest irony was that the very success that had given Hendrix freedom was also beginning to take it away. The more famous he became, the more people needed something from him. The more successful he became, the more commitments surrounded him. And the more audiences demanded from Jimi Hendrix, the less time he seemed to have simply to be Jimi. So why did a man standing at the very top of the world feel so directionless? Was the fame he had dreamed of becoming a burden? Was Hendrix being consumed by the very success he had worked so hard to achieve? By 1970, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The relentless schedule had taken a toll. His body was tired, his personal life was unstable, his professional relationships were complicated, and emotionally, he appeared increasingly vulnerable. Yet the world still expected Jimi Hendrix to perform, to create, to travel, to be the legend everyone believed he was. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of his story. Millions of people saw a superstar. Very few could see how exhausted the man behind the superstar had become. And as 1970 continued, the pressure would only become greater, until the life of one of the world's greatest musical talents reached its final, tragic chapter. Part 6. 1970. When everything began to fall apart. Jimi Hendrix entered 1970 as a superstar, but behind the fame, his life was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The previous few years had transformed him from an unknown guitarist into an international icon, but success had brought enormous pressure with it. His schedule remained demanding, his professional relationships were becoming complicated, and the expectations surrounding his music seemed to grow with every passing month. And Hendrix himself was no longer the same man who had first arrived in London. His health was beginning to suffer under the strain of constant work and an exhausting lifestyle. He had spent years performing, recording, and traveling, often pushing himself far beyond what his body could comfortably handle. At the same time, his personal world was becoming increasingly unstable. People around him changed. Relationships became more complicated. Business disagreements created additional tension. Money was another source of pressure, despite his enormous fame. For someone who had once seemed surrounded by people, Hendrix increasingly appeared uncertain about whom he could actually trust. And that may have been one of the most painful aspects of his final year. Fame had brought him thousands of admirers, but it had also made genuine trust much harder to find. Who was really there for Jimi Hendrix? Who wanted to protect him? And who wanted something from him? By this point, Hendrix was reportedly feeling increasingly directionless. The future that once seemed limitless had begun to feel uncertain. And then came a haunting statement attributed to Hendrix. "I'm not sure I will live to be 28 years old." He was only 27. For most people, 28 would barely seem like the beginning of adulthood. But for Hendrix, the words carried a disturbing sense of finality. Why would a man so young feel that his time was running out? Was he simply expressing the fears of a young musician under enormous pressure? Or did he understand just how badly his health and circumstances were deteriorating? We cannot know exactly what was going through his mind. What we do know is that by 1970, Hendrix was facing a dangerous combination of pressures: physical exhaustion, emotional strain, complicated relationships, professional conflicts, and the relentless demands of being Jimi Hendrix. And there was another problem. The world still wanted more. More concerts, more records, more performances, more of the extraordinary guitarist audiences had come to believe could do almost anything. But behind that expectation was a human being who needed rest, stability, and time. Instead, the pressure continued. As the months passed, the distance between the public image of Jimi Hendrix and the private reality of his life seemed to grow wider. On stage, he remained the legendary guitarist. Off stage, he was a young man struggling with a life that had become increasingly difficult to navigate. And by September, the questions that had been building throughout the year would suddenly become much more serious. What did Hendrix truly know about the condition he was in? And could anyone around him see that the young man who seemed to have everything was already approaching the edge of his limits? Only months after saying he might not live to 28, Jimi Hendrix would be gone. The final night was approaching. Part 2. The Boy Nobody Knew. Where did Hendrix begin? Long before the screaming crowds, the legendary guitar solos, and the image of Jimi Hendrix as a musical revolutionary, there was simply a boy growing up in Seattle, Washington. Jimi Hendrix was born in 1942 into a family that faced financial difficulties and instability. His childhood was far removed from the glamorous world he would eventually enter. There was no indication that this quiet young boy would one day become one of the most recognizable musicians of the 20th century. His early years were shaped by circumstances that were often difficult. Family struggles meant that life could be uncertain, and Hendrix grew up experiencing challenges that many children around him might never have understood. But somewhere in the middle of that uncertainty, he discovered something that would change the direction of his life: music. For Hendrix, music was more than entertainment. It became a way of expressing emotions that were difficult to put into words. As his interest in the guitar grew, the instrument gradually became an extension of himself. He experimented, listened, practiced, and searched for sounds that seemed to exist only in his imagination. And perhaps this was the beginning of what would later make him so different. Hendrix was not simply interested in playing the notes that other musicians had already played. He wanted to discover what else the guitar could do. But at this stage, almost nobody outside his immediate world knew his name. There were no massive audiences waiting for him, no record executives calling, no magazines describing him as a genius. No one could look at this young guitarist and confidently predict that he would eventually change the sound of rock music. That is what makes the beginning of his story so fascinating. When people remember Jimi Hendrix today, they often remember the finished legend: the electric guitar, the extraordinary performances, the experimental sounds and the stage presence that seemed almost impossible to imitate. But legends do not begin as legends. They begin somewhere much smaller. For Hendrix, that beginning was Seattle, and the guitar gradually became his language. When words were not enough, he could communicate through sound. When ordinary rules seemed limiting, he could experiment. And when the world did not yet understand what he was capable of, he continued developing his own voice. Yet there was a problem. Talent alone does not guarantee recognition. A musician can possess extraordinary ability and still remain invisible if the right people never hear them. And for years, that was essentially Hendrix's reality. He would eventually leave Seattle, move through different musical environments, perform with various artists, and slowly develop the skills that would later make him famous. But America would not immediately recognize the phenomenon that was developing in front of it. Instead, Hendrix would have to travel far from home before the world began to understand what he could do. The boy who had once been almost completely unknown was about to embark on a journey that would take him from small stages to the center of the international music scene. But if Hendrix possessed such extraordinary talent, why did America take so long to recognize him? And what happened when this unknown guitarist finally found the audience that had been waiting for him? Part 3. From Obscurity to England, the man who saw the genius. Before the world knew the name Jimi Hendrix, he spent years playing wherever he could find an opportunity. He performed with different bands, moved from one small venue to another, and gradually built his reputation as a remarkably talented guitarist. But talent did not immediately bring success. Hendrix was still largely unknown. He had the ability, the ambition, and an unmistakable instinct for music. Yet he had not found the environment that could truly showcase what he was capable of. For years, he remained a musician that most people simply did not notice. Then, everything changed with one meeting. Chas Chandler. Chandler, a musician who had been a member of the British rock group The Animals, saw something in Hendrix that others had overlooked. He did not simply see another guitarist, he saw potential. Chandler believed that Hendrix could become something much bigger if he were given the right opportunity, and he made a decision that would completely change the course of Hendrix's life. He took the relatively unknown American guitarist to England. For Hendrix, it was a huge gamble. He was leaving behind the musical world he knew and entering a British rock scene that was already producing some of the most exciting musicians of the era. But Chandler had a plan. Together, they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience, bringing Hendrix together with drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding. And then something remarkable happened. British audiences began to notice. Hendrix did not look or sound like the guitarists they were accustomed to seeing. His playing was aggressive, experimental, and unpredictable. He could make the electric guitar sound almost completely different from what audiences thought the instrument was capable of producing. But it wasn't only the sound. There was something about Hendrix himself, his movements on stage, his confidence, the way he controlled the instrument, the way he seemed to disappear into the music. Word began spreading through the British music scene. A mysterious American guitarist had arrived in London, and musicians were beginning to talk about him. Soon, some of the biggest names in British rock started paying attention. The guitarist who had spent years performing in relative obscurity was suddenly standing in rooms with musicians who had once seemed impossibly distant from his world. And this transformation happened with astonishing speed. Only a short time earlier, Hendrix had been struggling to find his place. Now, nobody had imagined before. His playing was aggressive, emotional, and unpredictable. He pushed the electric guitar beyond its traditional role, experimenting with distortion, feedback, and unusual sounds to create something that felt completely new. But Hendrix's genius was not only in his fingers. His entire body became part of the performance. He moved with the music, attacked the strings with extraordinary energy, and sometimes played the instrument behind his back or with his teeth. To audiences watching him for the first time, it could feel less like watching a guitarist and more like witnessing a completely new form of performance. And then there was the sound. Hendrix could make an electric guitar scream, whisper, explode, and almost seem to speak. His performances quickly became the stuff of legend. One story in particular captures how extraordinary his arrival was. At the time, Eric Clapton was already regarded as one of Britain's finest guitarists. Then Hendrix appeared on the London music scene. According to the famous story, Hendrix was invited to play alongside Clapton. Clapton was reportedly stunned by what he heard. The story goes that after Hendrix finished playing, Clapton was so overwhelmed by the young American's ability that he walked backstage, smoking a cigarette and trying to process what he had just witnessed. Whether every detail of the anecdote is accurate or not, the story has survived because it captures something important about Hendrix's arrival. Even great guitarists were paying attention. Hendrix was no longer simply another musician trying to make it. He was becoming a phenomenon. His recordings helped accelerate that transformation. With the Jimi Hendrix Experience, songs such as Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and Are You Experienced introduced listeners to a sound that seemed to come from somewhere in the future. His music combined psychedelic rock, blues, experimentation, and raw energy. And Hendrix was only getting started. His performances continued to attract larger audiences, while his reputation spread far beyond Britain. Then came one of the moments that helped turn him into an international icon: his appearance at Woodstock in 1969. His performance of the Star-Spangled Banner became one of the most remembered moments of the festival, transforming the familiar national anthem into something distorted, dramatic, and deeply connected to the turbulent atmosphere of America at the time. The guitarist, who had once struggled to gain attention in his own country, was suddenly impossible for America to ignore. His name spread around the world, his image became iconic, his sound influenced musicians who would come after him. And Jimi Hendrix had achieved something remarkably few artists ever accomplish. He changed the way people thought about an entire instrument. But success has another side. The bigger Hendrix became, the greater the demands placed upon him. More concerts, more recording, more attention, more expectations. The world had fallen in love with the extraordinary guitarist. But behind the stage lights was still a young man trying to navigate fame, pressure, and an increasingly complicated life. And that raised a question that would become more important with every passing year. When the whole world finally began to love Jimi Hendrix, was Jimi Hendrix truly happy with the life that fame had created for him? Part 8. Jimi Hendrix was gone, but the legend had just begun. Jimi Hendrix was gone at just 27 years old, but his story did not end there. In many ways, that was only the beginning of his greatest influence. The guitarist who had spent only a few short years at the center of the international music scene left behind an impact that would continue spreading long after his death. Generation after generation of guitarists would discover Hendrix and attempt to understand what made his playing so different. Some tried to imitate his sound, others studied his technique, and many eventually realized that the greatest lesson Hendrix left behind was not simply how to play the guitar. It was the freedom to experiment. Hendrix showed musicians that an electric guitar did not have to sound the way people expected it to sound. It could be powerful. It could be strange. It could be emotional. It could become an entirely new instrument in the hands of someone willing to experiment. And that idea would influence musicians across generations and genres. Rock musicians followed his path. Heavy guitarists studied his techniques. Blues players admired the emotion in his playing. Experimental musicians were inspired by his willingness to ignore conventional boundaries. Even decades later, new listeners continued discovering his music for the first time. More than half a century after his death, Hendrix's performances are still watched, his recordings are still played, his songs are still discussed, and his name remains one of the first names that comes to mind whenever people talk about the greatest guitarists in history. That is remarkable when you consider how short his career actually was. Hendrix did not have decades to develop his legacy. He had only a few extraordinary years. Yet within that incredibly short period, he managed to change the way millions of people heard the electric guitar. And perhaps that is what makes his story so fascinating. His influence was not limited by time. It crossed generations. A teenager discovering Purple Haze today can experience the same sense of surprise that audiences felt when Hendrix first appeared on stage decades ago. The technology may have changed, the musical landscape may have changed, but the feeling remains. There is also an unanswered question that will probably never disappear. If Jimi Hendrix could change the history of the guitar in only a few years, what could he have accomplished if he had lived to 40, 50, or 60? Would he have created completely new forms of music? Would he have worked with musicians who had not yet entered the scene? Would he have explored jazz, electronic music, or sounds that did not yet exist? Would his influence have become even greater? Nobody can know. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most haunting part of his legacy. Because Jimi Hendrix's life was not a story of an artist who slowly reached the end of his creative journey. It was the story of a young genius whose journey was suddenly interrupted. Perhaps the greatest tragedy in Jimi Hendrix's story is not that he died at 27. It is that we will never know how far a genius like him could have gone.